Hello there, and welcome to another A-Tippling Philosopher video and another interview. I am excited to introduce to you. Well, I say introduce. He's been on before, and we've had a chat before, and we were talking about the swoon theory before. So go and check out that video, which is whether Jesus, when he was crucified, whether he survived the crucifixion and was revived somehow afterwards. And we talked about that. Well, I've got Ed Dodge back on again, and we are going to talk about quite a bit of philosophy of religion, philosophy to do with free will, so on and so forth. And I'm not quite sure where it's going to go in this chat, which is quite exciting for me. I like that kind of stuff. This is going to be a pretty organic discussion. But thanks for coming on, Ed, and welcome again.
Yeah, thanks for having me, John. It's really great to be here. And yeah, I've actually been really looking forward to this conversation too. I've been following your work on, you read a lot about atheism and free will, and obviously read a lot about Christianity from a perspective of the atheist. And just to lay my position out here in the beginning, I pretty much agree with you and most atheists in your critiques of Christianity, like pretty much down the line, like 100%. Like I don't accept any kind of Christian authority either. And I've written a book, History of the Goddess, where I talk about Old Testament and New Testament stuff from a very radically different perspective because I was looking, there's the book. You can get it now on Amazon.
And the ratings look pretty good. So that's good rating. And yeah, go and get it.
And so in that book, I was exploring the character of Asherah, and that's where I got started anyway. Was Asherah is said to be the Israelite mother goddess, the wife of El and Yahweh in the Old Testament, and so a lot of people have been wondering about who she is, and so was I because I'd never heard of her, so I wanted to know who Asherah was, and what I discovered was that there's an entire set of traditions around the Divine Mother in some capacity or another, but a series of pagan traditions around mother goddesses and goddesses in general. And that the Israelites, with regard to the Israelites were pagans before they became monotheists. So historically speaking, now the Bible doesn't tell us the story, but history tells us the story that, when the historical Israelites lived in Judah and Israel, in reality, in the real world, they were pagans at that time. They weren't monotheists.
How would you define pagan? I always find pagan problematic.
It's an umbrella term like Indian, for Native American. It's at a minimum it's polytheistic until you've got a set of traditions across the Near East that are interrelated from one community to the next, where they're following a common pattern, a common pantheon of the gods, and a common pattern where every community simply just, of all the neighboring communities, they're just changing the names of the gods, but it's a common set of traditions. But there's no central dogma, there's no central authority. So every community is free to change the names and come up with their own stories, but you see a consistent pattern of traditions. And one of those patterns that's really important are these dying and rising God traditions that people have identified. That Christianity models these other earlier, in some capacity, we can have a whole debate about, the connection, but there's not a debate that there are dying and rising gods. There's a whole series of them. And that at least superficially, there is some comparison to the Jesus resurrection myth, but that's another conversation for another day. My point about these traditions is that they're all traditions of a divine mother. And so when I was trying to learn about Asherah, and just like thinking about it for months, like how can God have a wife? I mean, that's what we're told. She's the wife of God. And so it took a while for my brain to really just like wrap my head around what this could possibly even mean. Like, because God, from the Christian perspective, is all encompassing of everything. And there's not really any theological space for something else. So I was really curious about, like, at a cultural level, what did these people believe? What were they doing? If you were following Asherah, what were you doing? And so I discovered that it was related to these other goddess traditions, like the Eleusinian mysteries, this traditions of Cybele that we see in Rome, but that were earlier, the traditions of Ishtar in Babylon. because Ishtar, there's another goddess in the Old Testament, which is Astarte, that King Solomon worshipped. So Astarte and Ishtar are the same goddess, effectively.
So having goddesses like this, I mean, does this presuppose gender? And if you're presupposing gender, is there going to be biological sex coming along here at some point? Which is to say, how does that really work with monotheism? How does that really work with actually any kind of abstract understanding of theism?
It's incredibly important to recognize that transgenderism was a big part of these traditions, and that they had transgender priests and eunuchs and shamans. Transgender people was like big part of like indigenous shaman traditions, and were a part of these traditions. They have a name for these priests. They're the Galli priests in Rome of Cybele. They're called the Megabyzi, and the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus. They're called the Inari among the Scythians, and then they're called the Gala and Sumer, and then in the Bible they're the Kadesh, and the female are the Kadesha, and they are the women are referred to as temple prostitutes, and the men are referred to as temple sodomites in the English translation of the Bible. But if you dig onto the literature, the male ones are considered equivalent to the Galli priests of Rome. And these were men that would castrate themselves in service of the mother goddess. And this was a big part of these traditions. They're trans people. They wouldn't have used all the same language and, psychological analysis that we use today, but it is clearly the same thread of a tradition all the way through history. Like, the trans people have always been around. They've always been around. And they were a big part of these traditions of the mother. And so when monotheism comes along, or when Christianity specifically comes along and becomes a state religion of Rome, and they start banning all the other traditions, both the Gnostics and the pagans, these are the kind of stuff that gets thrown out because it does not represent the father. It represents the mother alone. Or these traditions represent the mother, and the monotheists want to have a world where it's father alone and no divine mother at all. And so any of the traditions that reflected the divine mother get thrown out. So we're talking about ritual prostitution, any kind of women's independence and women's sexuality, because sex is a big part of these traditions, because they're cycle of life traditions and they're nature traditions, and they're called fertility cults. And they're all about, there's agricultural traditions. They're rooted in like the growing of crops and the turning of the seasons. That's what the dying God, rising God represents, is a turning of the seasons, life, death, and rebirth. Which
then gets represented symbolically through personification, as humans being allegories for nature in some sense, I presume.
Yeah, absolutely. And then they're in their rituals, they would be having sex in the temples. I mean, this is not like new scholarship. I mean, this has been regarded for a long time. And when Christianity takes hold authoritatively, this is exactly the stuff they throw out. And that has been condemned ever since. Like, we've condemned prostitution ever since. We certainly don't have ritual prostitution in the West. And they're doing plant drugs too. The psychedelics and cannabis, I argue, are a big part of these traditions too. They're being burned in the temple. And they are part of these sacred mother traditions. And so I wanted to understand, what were these traditions about and how do they relate today? And
I wonder if the Church of England can head off its decline in numbers if it just embraced sex in the temple, sex in the church again. Let's get the people back in the pews.
I think these things will be coming back around. These are really, really old traditions with very, very long timelines, and I don't see any reason why it couldn't or wouldn't come back around again. The psychedelics are certainly making their comeback, and they're a big part of this tradition too. And so, in learning about these, in learning about Asherah, and I recognize the key trick I recognized was two things. One was I learned it's just Mother Earth. It's like, who's the wife of God? It's like, oh, it's Mother Earth, the Heavenly Father and the earthly mother, and they go together and they're a matched pair. And in Christianity, we have just the Father alone, and they threw the mother off of her pedestal, but she never entirely went away, because we still have, we can still talk about Mother Earth, and it's a perfectly recognizable metaphor. Everyone knows what we're talking about. And then what I also recognized was that the cultural traditions were very similar to what the counterculture is doing today and our culture wars today. That these temple rituals where it's ecstatic dance and music and intoxicating drugs and sex. It's like, wow, this sounds like a modern day nightclub. Sounds like a modern day rave. Like, this is me and my friends at a Grateful Dead show. Like, this is today's counterculture, that you could transport it back to Ishtar's temple and like people wouldn't even miss a beat. And that's when I realized that our today's culture wars are totally wrapped up in these old religious reformations. And when I started examining the traditions, I just started seeing it right down the line of everything that we're disputing morally, everything that we're calling like a moral dispute in the culture wars, and that includes abortion, and gay, being gay, women's independence, all the stuff I've been talking about, that they were there. They would have been there in these traditions of Asherah and Rhea of the Greeks, or Cybele, and that then they never entirely went away out of our culture. That we've got the stuff the churches didn't like; they simply persecuted, but they never went away. So what to say?
That's Chindi Chimbalus, who's a fantastic supporter of the channel. So thank you so much. I heard about Asherah as God's wife from a documentary by Francesca Stav.
Yeah, I learned a lot from her too, and I would love to talk to her. I learned a lot from her.
Yeah, her documentary.
I totally agree with her teaching.
Yeah, her BBC documentary a few years back was absolutely superb. Actually, that's something I should watch again. Her book, I have. Oh no, I haven't. It's in my bag upstairs. Is a great book. I'm reading that at the moment. God, an Anatomy. Loving this discussion so far. Looking forward to more learning. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for supporting. And this is hopefully a good foundation to what Edward's going to go on to say. So carry on, Ed.
So, we can trace the story of Asherah and her being overthrown in the Old Testament all the way through, and that's a whole discussion unto itself. But what I'm interested in, and what kind of motivates me now, is bringing these stories into today's world and today's politics, because I'm very dissatisfied with where things are at with like today's liberalism, and the debate between like the MAGA and the woke here in America. I find both sides pretty distressing to me. But I do think these stories have relevance, and especially in regards to the environment. I've got a whole philosophy that I've been working on for many years regarding, energy stuff and a circular economy. And when I realized that my work I'd been doing on carbon cycle and clean energy, and my personal viewpoint that we can recycle our carbon emissions back into nature, back into our ecosystems. If we were restoring our ecosystems, it would be possible to do that. That's what my next blog post is going to be on this subject. That this totally translates back to the cycle of life traditions and these nature-based religions of the ancient world. And that when the monotheists came along, one of the things that happened culturally was that we broke free from thinking we're a part of nature. The mother is Mother Nature. So when you believe in the mother, you believe that you're wrapped up in nature and that we're all a part of nature, the way indigenous people teach us, the way the indigenous people view the world. But Western thinking, both in the Enlightenment and in Christianity, is that we're separate from nature. That nature is an other.
That's a really interesting point, because actually what you hear very often from Christians, for example, who are environmentally aware, is that the argument is, and it comes, I forget which verse it comes from, but it comes from the Bible, which is we are stewards of
it comes from Genesis, absolutely.
I forget which one, but we are stewards of God's earth, which is that, as you say, I've never really thought about that before, which is to extract yourself out from the whole network of the created world and being part of that created world in God's eyes, or however you want to see it, and say no, actually there's the created world and there's us, and we are somehow separate. There's some kind of human exceptionalism, and we are curating, we are looking after, we are caring for.
It's a fundamental tenet of biblical monotheism, is that we're separate from the world. It's a fundamental contrast with indigenous people who see nature as a big organism. All of the earth is one big organism, and we are just cells within a larger organism, just as we have microorganism within us. We have bacteria and viruses and thousands, millions of microorganisms living within our human bodies today. We are just a microorganism within the larger organism of the entire earth, and that is, in my opinion, the Divine Mother. And and the mother of all life, and that we have a biological and a moral imperative to cultivate and respect and take care of the mother. And if we had this as a cultural value, it would totally, our entire environmental, we wouldn't have this, we could motivate ourselves to, improve the environment, or / we wouldn't have destroyed it in the first place.
So is your idea, I mean, obviously you haven't really explained fully yet, but is your idea of how we should view the world, is that a symbolic view itself, or do you think that's actually how the world is? Do you know what I mean?
My view is presuppositional. I've actually come around. I'm a Enlightenment educated person. I was, been to good schools and got the top level science education. I am a very science knowledgeable person, and I believe in science. But I've come to the viewpoint in my adult life that it was sort of a gestalt, if you will, that I've come around to realizing or recognizing that the earth is literally a living creature, one big organism. And I see the world this way. And it is presuppositional. It's simply a function of worldview. And I believe science can back up this worldview.
What's the difference between seeing the world as a single organism and seeing it as an ecosystem, which I would see it as just, as a large ecosystem made up of smaller sub ecosystems?
Well, ultimately is just one big network. But the idea is that there is an intelligence to it, that there is actually that it's actually an intelligent organism. That the entire, this is something that we learn, again, from indigenous people and from psychedelics. This is what Terrence Mckenna calls Gaia Consciousness, that actually the plants are speaking to us.
So is that a self-awareness, or is that an intentional conscious mind that has intention, which is to say it can understand meaning and representation, and it has intention?
Yeah, these are all good questions. The nature of plant intelligence, I'm not deeply versed into giving the finer points, but I've definitely gotten to the point that I think there is intelligence there. And that there's a definitive intelligence to, and we see it in like fungi, and the mycorrhizal fungi is really where we're seeing the cutting edge of science that's showing the interconnected web of communication among plant species in the forest, that the mycorrhizal fungi link all the various, through the root systems and through the soil, connect all the different creatures, all the different plant life in the forest, all connect together as a single organism through the networks of mycorrhizal fungi in the soil. And there's a communications network there. And, there are these old tropes and anecdotes from like loggers who talk about how they'll start cutting in on one side of the forest, and they're starting to cut down the trees. And by the time they get to the other end of the forest, the trees are seeming to fight them. The trees are twisting and turning and falling on them, and like really resisting and making it harder to cut, and that it gets harder to cut as they go on. And these are like old, myths, right? Of the loggers, but you hear these stories, and you hear them, kind of all over. And when you start to add all the stories all up, it does seem to think like, there's an intelligence. But really, it was Terrence Mckenna who really laid it out. He does like these heroic levels of, the late Terrence Mckenna, these heroic levels of psychedelics, which I've never done. And he, gets very, very deep into all of this.
So, is Terrence Mckenna the guy who developed the Gaia theory?
Yeah, well, James Havelock was credited with that. Terrence Mckenna talks about Gaia consciousness, and he has the stoned ape theories, which he's most famous for, which is the idea, human consciousness at the cognitive leap was coming from some type of, plant drug interaction.
So, the question, I would always be sort of trying to adhere to an evidence-based belief system, right? So,
sure, me too.
What I would challenge is whether, you know, this is all anecdotal. What's the hard evidence for there being, and also you need to understand, define quite closely what one means by intelligence. But if what do you think? So going back to these pagan mythologies or pagan belief systems back in the ancient Near East or anywhere in the world, do you think they are how do you think they're tapping into this, what you believe is
well, I think the traditions of the mother, and this is why I go through my book, I think the traditions of the mother are our oldest religious traditions, and that they go back deep, all the way back to the cognitive leap, effectively. And that they are represented by our oldest symbolic art. When you go back deep into the Ice Age, there's, you know, three pieces of evidence of culture that we still see. We see cave paintings, we see ritual burials, and we see Venus figurines, of which we have thousands and thousands of these carved, what they call, you know what I'm talking about, the Venus figurines, the Venus of Willendorf. So these small little statues that they were making, we found thousands, archaeologists have found thousands of them over tens of thousands of years. And they are being made continually, right up into, like, you know, classical antiquity. And so, and you see traditions of mother goddesses all the way through our historical mythology. And then I track the histories through, you know, the Mesopotamians specifically, because that's what leads directly into the Bible.
So what do mother goddesses represent? Why do you think early?
She represents the very origins of everything. The very origins of everything was a mother that gives birth to her husband, who is God. So basically, when I'm talking about the divine mother, I'm talking about the mother of God and the mother of the biblical God. So she is, God makes order from chaos. She is the chaos. Like, she was the primordial chaos from which everything else comes. What they would have called the primordial salt waters. That was the symbolism for the Mesopotamians.
So so explain, because the idea would be, if we're going to go back to sort of just dabble a little bit in early Judaism and then Christianity, but if you're going back to the origins of the Bible and you're talking about, okay, this is probably coming out of Canaanite peoples, who would have been, having very similar belief systems from people around. What was going on in their sort of their Genesis accounts of how the world came to be?
Right. Actually, this is going to be one of my next pieces I write. We've got 3 generations of tradition in terms of Genesis. So with Genesis 1 of the Bible being the third, it's been well noted that the opening lines of Genesis track back to the opening lines of the Enuma Elish from the Babylonian creation story, where we have Tiamat and Apsu. Tiamat is the salt waters, as I was mentioning. She is the very primordial mother goddess of all. And her name is Tiamat, and she's a kind of a villain. And Marduk's got to defeat her when Marduk becomes king of the gods. But there's an even earlier version, which is from Sumer, another 1,000 years before that, where Namu is the primordial salt waters, the primordial mother goddess. And she is good. She is kind and beneficent. And so she actually creates humans with Enki. She is the mother of the creator gods, of which An is the sky father. And then Ki becomes the earth mother. And then An Ki represents, like, that was creation, heaven and earth, An Ki. So An is the original sky father. Ki is the birth mother. She becomes, her name changes to Ninhursag, and then she basically becomes Asherah. Whereas in An, he becomes El of the Bible. His name changed also to Anu, also for the Babylonians. And then he becomes El in the Bible. It's the same God. He's the primordial, original sky father, and he's distant and removed from human affairs. He's not really getting involved in our stuff. It's his son, who is the king of the gods, who's actively involved in human affairs. And the king of the gods changes from one culture to the next and from one political regime to the next. And so you get all these stories of one set of gods overthrowing another set of gods. That's because some new political regime came along, defeated the old political regime, and writes mythology about how their god is now the greatest god, and whatever previous gods were vile and had to be destroyed. I mean, it's propaganda. These are like, political propaganda as mythology. That's the way they did it. And so you have a series of these kings of the gods, all of whom are the son of the same primordial sky father. And so when you get into the Bible, we're talking about El is in the Israelites, Israel, they're followers of El. And the original king of the gods was Baal. And so when Yahweh comes along, Yahweh is a young God. He's not a really old God. He only emerges on the world stage in the Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BC, give or take. He was not an old God. El had been around for a long, long time, but Yahweh was a new God. And Yahweh comes along as a cultural reformer. I mean, the people that are following Yahweh, again, this is all the stuff is taking place in a cultural context of people doing stuff on the street in their towns, And so Yahweh first of all, he's challenging Baal. Yahweh wants to be the new king of the god. So he's got to fight with Baal. And you see these stories.
Which is a reflection of the people being sort of henotheistic, which is to say the monolatry, it's also called, or some people call it.
I don't even think they're all that monolatrous, to be honest with you. I think they're just pagans.
Yeah. So, but the idea is that where you see Yahweh fighting with Baal and trying to overcome Baal, that is because you have, one presumes, Yahweh followers who are saying our God is the cool God, is the number one God, and therefore with our traditions,
we're going to have... for really good reasons. I actually want to be clear about this. Yahweh, there's some really good things that the Yahweh reforms are bringing in. They want to end child sacrifice. Like the cult of Baal, they really did in fact do child sacrifice, and this is a really vile tradition. And we have archaeological evidence from Carthage, because the Canaanites and the Israelites and the Phoenicians are all, the cult of Baal is a Phoenician religion basically, and it was all over the Mediterranean. So we have evidence of what they were doing, and they really did do child sacrifice. So that's nasty. They really did do idolatry, where they were, dressing up the statues with clothes and stuff. And that's kind of dumb, I guess. Not as gross as child sacrifice, but they also had these sex traditions. They also had these Kadesha priestesses and the transgender priests and the temple prostitution, and they're doing it in King Solomon's temple. The Kadesha and the Kadesh are both listed repeatedly in the Bible, but they're only mentioned when they're being thrown out. But when you mention them that they're being thrown out, the implication is that they had been there all along. And so the Kadesha are there. They're the ritual prostitutes. The cult of Yahweh wants to put them out of business. He wants to put the women out of business. He wants to put the temple sex out of business. And he wants to take all the traditions that they consider unsound and get rid of them. And like I said, a lot of that stuff we would totally agree with. Like nobody is going to advocate for infant sacrifice, although you see the parallel debate in abortions. So,
I mean, do we have a movement towards more rules? So, as we look at the Hebrew
Bible, that's another thing they do is centralizing the religion. This is actually key. There was the reforms of Josiah and Hezekiah both. They want to centralize religion at the Jerusalem temple and shut down all the countryside, because paganism was very much of a community-based religion. It's a family-based, community-based. It's from the ground up. There's no centrality to it. Every community would have their own, they're called high places in the Bible. You would have your own local altars that are just run by whatever local community priests. And the reformers of Josiah and Hezekiah, they want to shut down those country altars and centralize all the religious worship back under their central authority. And this is also a key reform that plays along in Christianity, because Christianity is a totally authoritarian religion where everything is centralized that way. So that's another really important tradition that they interject.
Yeah. And it's really interesting. So you look at things like the Elephantine Papyri, that's something I've mentioned a few times, which are these set of 100 documents that have been found in the 400s, I think. And they really show that the Hebrew Bible is a late construction, because these are huge amounts of documents that show absolutely no evidence of any of the, the United Monarchy, any of the old patriarchs of the Bible. All the stories that you think have been around for so long actually don't appear, and there's no biblical names in these documents at all. And in fact, there's also evidence that what they were doing in the temples at the time was actually strictly against biblical law. And so therefore that biblical law couldn't have been established at that time, therefore also leading towards the idea that the Bible really was a much later construct. The Hebrew Bible really was a much later construction, maybe in the exilic and post-exilic periods, which is,
I mean, post-exile. Yeah. I mean, it's all, everything pre-exile, they were not Jewish. They were not monotheists. They were not Jewish. They would not have even understood the concept. If you went back in time and asked them if they were monotheists, they would have had no idea what you were talking about. That entire concept doesn't even emerge until probably after they get involved with the Zoroastrians and with the Persians in Babylon. And there you see Yahweh. And at this point, they take Yahweh and El, who had historically been two separate gods, and they fuse them together to make them into one God. So Genesis 1 is Elohim only. There's no Yahweh in Genesis 1 and they're in the 7 days of creation. Yahweh comes along in Genesis 2 in the Garden of Eden story, Genesis chapter 2, in the Garden of Eden story. And then it's Yahweh dash Elohim, and it's a conjunctive. They put the names together to fuse them together as a single God. And that story had to have been written later, had to have been written almost surely post-exile.
Which plays into multiple source theories and the idea of you got the J and the E, the Yahwist and the Elohim, Elohist sources that then get fused together, and then you have the Deuteronomics.
And another note on this is that the Hebrew language as a written language doesn't even emerge until like 850 BC. Like there's not even any because literacy had broken down in the Bronze Age collapse, and Hebrew emerges as a new language, as a new written language. And so there's nothing being written before like the 9th century at all. Moses didn't write anything because they didn't even have that written language back then. King Solomon didn't write anything because they didn't have the written language then. The written language doesn't appear till later on.
And what was interesting as well, so taking it a step back to when you're talking about the creation stories, is that actually there's an argument to say that the Hebrew Bible isn't creation ex nihilo. So it isn't this idea that you've got this monotheistic God just existing in God world and then popping into existence the everything, all contingent stuff, but actually that God was reforming pre-existing material, which
100%. I didn't get to this point. So you get the Sumerian version with Namu is the primordial salt waters. Then 1,000 years later, Tiamat is the primordial salt waters, but now she's been turned into a villain. 1,000 years after that, you get the Genesis creation story. And now what you see is the opening line of Genesis is, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, and the earth was formless and void, and the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. The Spirit of God hovered over the waters. Joseph Campbell pointed out to me that those waters, that's Tiamat. The waters, it doesn't say God created the waters. God created the heaven and the earth, and the waters were already there. The waters is the mother. But what they're doing is they're taking away her name, which is a very powerful symbolic act. To name something is to give it life, is to give it reality, and to take the name away is equally powerful. And so you get this third generation creation story where the waters are still there. They're still identified, but they're not given a name. And it's very important. God creates the heaven and the earth, does not say that he created the waters. The implication is that the waters were already there because the waters are the primordial chaos from which God was born and from which he creates the order. And it parallels the Egyptian creation myths as well, where Ra comes out of the primordial chaos. They don't call it waters, they don't call it a mother, but it's their theme is order and chaos, whereas the pagans it was mother and father.
I just want to, before we go on, say thank you very much to Margaret de Velden. Really, really kind. Thank you for that. Obviously in Canada, one assumes. What or why write a story that has Moses force the Israelites to drink water with the ground gold of statue Baal?
What the story is.
So this is the idolaters. So this is when Moses goes up Mount Sinai and doesn't come down.
They build a golden bull though,
and they build a golden bull. Now this is interesting actually, because some people say what they've done is they're creating a false idol of the golden bull Baal, represented Baal, and they're worshipping this idol. But actually, I don't think that's what's going on there, and I think that's a misinterpretation of the story. So scholars are split on this. I agree that actually what's happening is they're getting impatient and they're creating not a false idol, but actually that's an idol for effectively representing Yahweh. But what Moses is getting angry at when he comes back down and then forces them to like imbibe the molten statue or whatever, is their impatience. So rather than getting angry that they are worshipping a false god, he's getting angry that they just didn't have patience, and in fact this isn't idolatry. So but there are two competing interpretations.
I'll tell you what I think the story is. I think the golden bull, and this is not the only time they have a golden bull. The golden bull comes back again later when Israel and Judah split. The golden bull is the symbol of El. It is their traditional pagan. I wondered about this story ever since I was a child. I was like, what? Where did Aaron is Moses' brother? Moses takes off for a while, and Aaron, who's also a high priest, all of a sudden builds his golden bull. Like, where did he even get the idea to build a golden bull? Why would they build a golden bull in the first place? Where did the idea even come from? And I finally dawned on me was that it wasn't a new idea. This was simply their traditional religion. This is what they'd been doing for 1,000 years. They're followers of El, and the golden bull is the bull of heaven. It's a symbol of El. And Moses is a reformer. He's trying to tell them to stop doing these old traditions. And this is exactly the old traditions he wants them to stop doing. But this was their traditional religion. And so then later on, when Israel splits from Judah, the first thing that Rehoboam does, or Jeroboam, I mean, who leads the revolt in Israel, the first thing he does is build two new golden bulls, one in Bethel and one in Dan. And to mark that they're breaking away from the Jerusalem temple and the worship of Yahweh, they are going to they're breaking off politically from that authority, and they're going back to their traditional pagan ways. And they erect two golden bulls, which continue to stand in Israel for the entire history that country exists. The golden bulls in Bethel and Dan were there the entire time. They were simply traditional pagan Israelite paganism, and there is just this is just them doing their native old stuff that the followers of Yahweh are trying to reform away.
Yeah, and it does seem to be this movement towards a far greater rule-based system. You've got the Decalogue, but you've actually got the Covenant Code. So there is I'm writing the book on the Exodus at the moment. It's been a long time coming, but I adhere to the theory that the entire Hebrew Bible, all of the Pentateuch, is a movement towards just delivering moral code. So everything is moving towards the whole Exodus. Everything isn't really about anything other than moving towards delivering and authenticating the moral code that comes afterwards, which is the Covenant Code, the Decalogue, and all this. But it seems to very much a rule-based system, and quite a hardcore sort of a large step away from, I would imagine, what the pagan society was. Or the pagan society.
Absolutely. It is a authoritarian rule-based system for sure, where they're trying to impose a new morality. It's not that they're inventing morality for the first time. The pagans had their own morality. You can read Sumerian. They're actually deeply moral people, the ancient Sumerians, and our oldest written stuff has all sorts of actually really profound morality that I actually really found what they call the widows and orphans rule, that the righteousness of a king should be judged by the quality of life of the poorest of the poor in the community. I think that's a perfectly decent rule,
well, actually, so the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, and the Covenant Code, particularly the Covenant Code, are based on earlier legal codes and law codes. So you've got the Hittite Code, you've got the Code of Hammurabi, you've got what else? You've got
it reflects this same change I'm talking about. And again, you can look at the Kadesha and how they are listed in these various law codes. The oldest ones you see they're in the Hammurabi's law codes, and the older ones, because they're called the Kaditsu in Mesopotamian or in Sumerian. I'm not an expert on the languages, but you see these cognate names being used. Or they're called just like the sanctified women. They get various terms for them. But in the oldest law codes, they have the best property rights. And as the law codes move forward over time, they lose their property rights gradually until you get to the law codes of Deuteronomy, and they say your daughter should not be a Kadesha at all. and they put them out of business. And so you see this transition in the morality, specifically in regards to these women's businesses, where the women are being shunted down and losing their rights and their
so the question is why do you see this? And this will probably,
it's a fair
you
question.
know, feed into what, you know, if you want to go back to some idea of this idea.
My view of history is that we've got basically 12,000 years since the dawn of the Neolithic, and that the first 6,000 of those years is basically Neolithic settlements where, as far as we can tell, they're egalitarian cultures. Men and women have equal rights. There's no war. There's no dominance hierarchies. There's no kings. There's no slaves. There's no evidence of warfare. No evidence of wide-scale fighting.
Is this because no one was competing for resources, particularly?
Yeah. And so around 6,000 years ago, around 4,000 BC, we get into the Bronze Age. Now, a bunch of things happen at this point. First of all, the settlements have become prosperous enough that there's something worth stealing. Secondly, we have the introduction of weapons, the introduction of swords, shields, the rest of it. And so we start to have the ability of raiders to start attacking settlements and stealing their stuff and forcing the people into slavery. And this is where the warrior kings start to take over and start to take power. And so gradually from 4,000 BC going forward, the men start to assert themselves. The warrior kings and the authoritarian patriarchal structures assert themselves more and more and more over time. And they're getting stronger and stronger over time. But throughout the Bronze Age, you still see the women have halfway decent rights. But then with the Bronze Age collapse, now you're familiar with the Bronze Age collapse, like from like 1200 to 1000 BC is a complete wipeout in the Near East. All the civilizations completely break down, complete breakdown of writing, complete breakdown of governance. It's a 200-year dark age. And it's out of that, from 1000 BC going forward, that we get the classical antiquity. We get the Jews of the Old Testament, we get the Greeks, and so on, the first millennium. But it seems like after the Bronze Age collapse, I'm totally speculating here. I almost want to say that it's like they scapegoat the women or something, like, because the Greeks do it too. The Greeks take away the women's rights as well as the Hebrews do. And we see parallels in their traditions where, specifically speaking, where Eve and Pandora both represent the first woman in both traditions. And in both cases, she's the source of all men's suffering. Like, why do we suffer? Because the women. It was the women's fault. They unleashed all this suffering on us. And it's like this scapegoating of women and a justification to keep the women locked down and in the house, basically. And not let them
I wonder, again, I would be speculating because I don't know nearly enough about, I've not researched this in particular, but would it be as we start developing structures, organizational structures, things become about power? And then, you know, that's where you start getting ideas of authoritarian and totalitarianism. And this is just another manifestation of a desire and a battle for power.
Yeah, more or less. Yeah, totally. And power, likes to consolidate, and, wealth and power both are always seeking to consolidate. It's sort of got its own mind of its own, if you will. And so given a chance to be authoritarian, people will. And, men asserting themselves over women, it's pretty clear to me that happened, and but it happened gradually over time, and probably for a variety of reasons and all sorts of subtext that, you could talk for an hour, hours about every subtext, but I think the overall trend that, women lose their rights is pretty clear.
Right. Okay. So where do we go from there then? So linking this back to what you believe and where you see society going now.
Well, I think where we're at today is that, a profound transformation in human civilization is happening. I mean, just look around. We've gone through the looking glass technologically. It's the space age, the nuclear age, the cyber age. We're not going back to even the analog world, much less the pre-industrial world. And so our society is rapidly shifting, and it's having huge impacts on our religion. The old religions are failing us. Christianity, Islam, the old traditional religions with these Iron Age ideas just are not cutting it anymore. And
do you what because they are morally outdated? Is that the main reason?
Partly,
Is that
and their claims of authority don't stack up to the scrutiny anymore. It used to be that Christianity could claim all this authority when people didn't read the Bible and couldn't even read the Bible at all, much less have any evidence of what the Bible's about. And then you get to the, because the Catholics, they didn't even encourage people to read the Bible. Then you get to the Protestant Reformation and people start reading the Bible for the first time at home. So you got a couple hundred years of people just reading the Bible and getting to know it. And then you've got for the last 200 years or 150 years even, we've got all this modern scholarship and archaeology that's allowed us to unpack where the Bible came from and all the, everything that's behind it. And now people like you and me and all sorts of home scholars are reading, all these old texts and realize that none of these claims of authority hold up at all.
But which is absolutely true. But given the power of cognitive dissonance and other psychological heuristics and biases and mechanisms, and given how doggedly people can hold on to bad ideas. I mean, you mentioned sort of MAGA earlier on, people who deny climate change.
Yeah, no, it's going to be a reformation. It's a culture war. I think we're heading towards like a big bloody conflict.
Yeah. So, I mean, because if we were to be purely, if we were to have faith in the rationality of humanity, then you'd think,
I have zero faith.
Exactly. Therefore, you can see religion dying off, and there being a new age coming on of, I don't know, whatever. But I don't know. I look at the ease with which misinformation and disinformation can pass around, and that people can doggedly hold on to bad ideas, and I just wonder exactly where we're going. I think the next few years is going to be fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I think that here in America, this country was founded by white Protestants, and we had, structured systems of racism built around, white Protestant ideals and white Protestant worldview. And, my people, for the record. And the nature of Christian theology is that they believe that they're right and everybody else is wrong. Muslims teach the same thing. They're correct and everybody else is wrong. And speaking in terms of Christians, they feel perfectly entitled to minority rule. And if democracy is going to be in the way of a Christian culture, I think the Christians will, the militant Christians. I'm not trying to castigate your cultural Christians. I'm talking about the militant ones. That there will be militant Christians that will be perfectly willing to embrace a civil war, to ensure a Christian culture over a non-Christian culture. And I just don't think the white Protestants are going to give up their position without a fight. Like, I don't think Christian culture is going down without a fight. Meanwhile, on the other side, on the progressive side, the trans folks, the BLM folks, the gays, the feminists, they're not giving it up either. Like, no one's backing down. No one's backing down from their positions. Everybody's heading towards conflict because these modern things like transgenderism is a really good symbol of this, is fundamentally incompatible with a Christian worldview. Not because trans people weren't always around, but because Christians pushed them under the rock. Trans people used to be around, and Christians pushed them, out of sight, out of mind, and pretended they don't exist. And for trans people to come back around and say, we're back, it is really blowing the Christians' mind. And you see it here in America. Like, they really can't accept it culturally.
Yeah, I mean, I think Christian, dominionism and Christian nationalism are seem to be, well, there's a lot's going on here. So it's interesting. I'm starting to write for a new secular media organization.
Yeah, no, I really want to engage with that whole group with Only Sky for sure. I saw what you're doing there.
Yeah, so Only Sky, and it's really interesting. So one of the threads of things that we're sort of are going to be big on our agenda is actually Christian nationalism. So it is a real threat. There's a lot of people feeling that is genuinely, this minority, very vocal but very powerful. It has like there's a lack of balance of power. They just for the amount.
I was there on January 6th. I was on the Capitol grounds on January 6th. I saw all that stuff happen with my own two eyes. I didn't go in the building, but I was on the Capitol grounds. Like, that was the opening shots of a civil war. I don't know when the next round of fighting is going to come, But I saw it like.
So what I think you find is that as people are threatened, it's very much like an injured animal, or like any kind of animal that's backed into a corner. They're going to be scratching and gnarly, getting pretty vicious. So as atheism, secularism, science, and all these ideas are gaining the intellectual high ground, or the evidential high ground, I think people who believe these things and want to hold on to their identity and their culture will be coming out fighting, because they are feeling threatened,
100%.
existentially threatened. And I talk about this a lot in other videos, something called mortality salience and terror management theory. So when you argue with, say, a young earth creationist, and you go and present the counter arguments against a young earth creationist, when you're presenting evidence that the world is older than 6,000 years, right? What you aren't really doing is presenting evidence that the world is 6,000 years old and having a fight over that. What you're doing is you're saying, here's a bunch of evidence that is going to challenge your access to eternal life in heaven. Right. And so the argument is far more, has far greater ramifications in the age of the world. I mean, really, you could be arguing about anything. It doesn't really matter. The point is that whatever you're arguing about is challenging their entire existential,
Totally. I had another good story. I don't want to name any names, so I got to present the story correctly. But I was, there's a bunch of story where I reinterpret a lot of Bible stories because I'm just looking at it from a different angle. And so I'm reinterpreting. I was talking about Miriam, the sister of Moses, and I'm presenting some theories about her and what might have happened and why. If you're familiar with the story, Miriam is like a very important character, but then she's a prophetess, but then God punishes her. And they have she has this argument with Moses. It's very ambiguous, like what they're really fighting about. And then God punishes her, and then she sort of disappears from the narrative and she never comes back. And so I have this whole chapter speculating on that whole story. So I have a friend of mine for whom the Miriam story is very important to her. She's Christian, and she's not American, so she's got a different ethnic background, and the Miriam story is very important in their traditions. And she was telling me how she didn't even want to hear my story, not because she didn't think my scholarship was good or anything, but because in their cultural traditions, Miriam was so important, and it's so wrapped up tight in their worldview and in their ethnic worldview that it was just too much cognitive dissonance for her to even think about it. Like, she didn't want to even think about Miriam in a different way. And she acknowledged it. This is not an academic argument. This is a purely tribal kind of thing. She didn't say that, but like, that's what it is. It's like, my tribe looks at the story this way. I'm content with that explanation. That explanation is soothing to my heart. Why would I want to even import any new ideas that change that? Yeah. Why would I want to change something that I like?
Yeah, and because that can then have a knock-on effect here and there and everywhere, and yeah, it's all so when you are challenging people who are fervent, believers in X, Y, and Z, that has a knock-on, politically, then their backs are against the wall. They're going to come out fighting because they've got everything to lose. And when I say everything to lose, they've got eternal access to eternal paradise to lose. And what could be on the line is their existence in hell eternally. So
they think that the world is literally going to be inhabited by demons. Yeah, like they think that this is like spiritual warfare on the ground, and that all these trans people and all these liberals with their wild clothes are like literal demons. I mean, if you listen to the Christian right wingers talk about the left wing, that's how they describe them, and they'll have all these really funny, hilarious pictures of crazy Antifa folks with their freak outfits on, who are intentionally being freaky, and the Christians are like, look how freaky they are. They're a bunch of demons. And so it really comes back to just worldview. And when people, like you said, when people feel threatened, they're going to come out fighting.
And I think that you're getting a growing sort of polarization that's been happening since the 70s. I think that it's getting worse and worse and worse. So now you're starting not to really have swing voters. You're just one camp or the other camp. And in a two-party political system, without getting too political now, it's interesting that America is seen to represent democracy, right? You are fighting for democracy. You go around the world putting your flags in other people's countries and saying, yeah, you need democracy type thing, which is all very amusing, or not actually, desperately sad. But what's interesting is your version of democracy, very much like the British system, is a two-party first past the post electoral system, which is the least democratic you can possibly get, right? It's the narrowest form of democracy where you've only got two options to represent the entire spectrum of humanity, the political spectrum. And with those two options, you've got first past the post voting system, whereby actually people can get into power with less than 50% of the popular vote, etc., etc. So it's really, really problematic, and therefore that feeds into polarization, and you're never going to break that, because in order to break that, both parties have to give up some form of power to allow a third party, a fourth party, a fifth party in on the action. That's never going to happen. And so therefore you are stuck, I think, with unless the electoral college gets over to, it's just, that's never going to happen. So you are stuck with the two-party system, which then starts taking on identity politics, which is now, it's like, if you're an evangelical Christian, you are a Republican. Basically, if you're an atheist, broadly speaking, you're going to be, obviously there's a little bit of movement, but really it's becoming just these big identities, and a culture war is the battlefield upon which this fight is going to be held.
Yeah, no, because our democracy is grinding into dysfunction. It's been bought and sold. The parties are just totally for sale. And so, the highest bidder has long since won them out, and they're not speaking for the people anymore. And we've arrived at America's always had a schismatic culture, going back to the 1600s.
Bob Price says, "Hold my beer." I know he's a rabid Republican, so yeah, right. That's always interesting. Yeah. So yeah, not all atheists, of course. That is a very good point, Doc Pierre Romanaut. But yes, so where would you? So in going back to your worldview, which is some kind of Mother Naturism, do you, because hopefully you would believe, I would think, that if everyone adopted your kind of worldview, we wouldn't be in that kind of state.
I think that we need a. Here's where I disagree with the atheists. There's on a few things. I mean, we can talk about, I'm a deist, so I believe in God in that regard. I don't believe in like the character, the biblical character, but like you can't really dispute the deist position.
But by let's just tease that apart a bit. So in your deistic understanding of the universe or the world or existence, is there a single mind that has sort of personhood?
Here's what I think. I think we have a universe. We clearly, at least in my opinion, we have a universe that has all these natural laws in it: physics, gravity, geometry, mathematics, all this stuff, evolution. This universe came into being for some reason. There is some mysterious reason why the universe came into being. I don't know what it is, and neither does anybody else. But there is a reason there. Now, we have a tradition of calling that reason the Father. The Father, who put the universe in order, the authoritative figure that gave us all these laws of nature. We have that as a tradition. The question is that a good tradition, or is that not a good tradition? Now, as soon as you give the Father a name, or give the Father any specific attributes, or give him a character or an identity, or say he likes this, he likes that, he doesn't like this, doesn't like that, now you're into areas of dispute. Now you're into areas of debate and discussion where we can say, well, why do you think that? Why do you think he's got that name? Why do you think he has that character? Why do you suppose he hates faggots? How do you know that he likes this and hates that? The answer is nobody knows. We just make this stuff up. And we have schools of thought, and we have cultural traditions. So I view it as religion as this one long running conversation about the nature of God and the nature of reality. But in addition to that, I think there's a mother to go with the father. And this speaks to duality of life and the paradoxes of life. And that, I see paradoxes everywhere. That you've got to take the good with the bad and in everything in life. And so this duality of the divine is that there's a mother and a father. The father is the one who brings order and authority, and the mother is the mother of all life and the source of wisdom. And these are these pagan traditions. It's also in Hindu traditions. And then it translates to indigenous traditions of Mother Earth as a living organism. These are all different aspects of the feminine divine, all of which I believe in, all of which I find to be perfectly reasonable and rational. And once I came to the recognition that of as I was saying, seeing the earth as a living organism and meditating on these ideas of a mother, it actually helped me make sense of the father and put clarity on my own vision of what God means to me. Because in a dualistic way, I can craft a reality that makes sense in a way that monotheism never made sense. Like instinctively, monotheism just never made sense to me, but it never made me an atheist. I went down the path of comparative religion and mysticism and went down a different path. I never considered myself an atheist.
So it's almost like there's a Jungian duality going on here. I don't know enough about Jung, to be honest, but there's chaos and order, and these kind of ideas of duality is important.
Yeah, Jung, I haven't actually studied Jung that much, but what I do know about Jungian archetypes, I totally am following from that school for sure.
Yeah, so I mean, I have many challenges to your position, but one would be the claim that the universe started. That's not definitely, not even remotely sure about that. Where's my book on the subject? Here it is.
I mean, pagans believe in circular time, so like it would just be an expansion and contraction, and
right.
and endless cycles, which is fine by me. I don't have any problem with that.
So just going to plug, did God create the universe from nothing? Countering William Lane Craig's Kalam cosmological argument. That's my nice, everyone should go out and buy that for sure. It's a great book.
I think it's Roger Penrose, right? As the physicist who talks about, what comes before the Big Bang. Was it an expansion and contraction thing, that the Big Bang was like this point of maximum contraction and then it burst back out? I like to call the Big Bang the Big Birth, by the way. It's at the point where where the mother gave birth to everything.
But I suppose if you believe in a cyclical motif that you see, largely throughout life in general, and seasons, but then this is all about orbiting, and there's so much you can understand why they're cyclical natures to things. But you can argue that for the universe. You can, like, there's loop quantum cosmology and all sorts of different things where there are theories of big bounces, big crunches, and all this. So there are many different theories of how the universe either came to be or exists, because actually there's a lot to be said for the universe existing.
But you said the key word. You said they're all theories, right? They're all theories. No one actually knows. Like, no one knows for certain. So I embrace the word mystery. I'm quite comfortable with mystery. Like, mystery is fine. Like, I like the word mystery. It works for me.
Sure.
So I don't know too much.
The nature of theoretical physics is obviously that it's theoretical, but hopefully it's also using evidence and it's modeling things using known physics. So there is another element of it's not just here's a theory.
No, I agree. I mean, they're narratives that have explanatory value, and to the point that they have explanatory value, they're useful. And when they stop having explanatory value, they stop being useful. And so we go with the theory that has the best explanatory value. It's the same way mythology worked in the ancient world. Mythologies lasted as long as they had explanatory value. And as the culture shifted, the myths shift. As the old myth no longer functions, they get a new one. But you got to have some kind of narrative, because the whole human psyche works on narratives. We work on stories.
So that would be one of the big sort of area that I would of questioning I'd have for you. I mean, there's lots, but is your kind of approach one of wishful thinking, the fallacy of wishful thinking, which is say this is how I'd like it to be. It fits with how, you know, I would like to understand the universe and existence. Therefore, that's how I think it is.
You know, I'm a practical guy. I just go with what, you know, helps me walking down the street. Like what knowledge helps me get through my life in a better, more cohesive, more, you know, satisfying way. I try not to make things too complicated, and but I trust my instincts, and I'm a big believer in intuition and instinct, and so
I mean,
there's a
there's a
lot.
lot to be said for the epistemological position of pragmatism, which is, you know, if it works and it's usable, then, you know, that's knowledge for me, you know, even though maybe it's not objectively true, if there's such a thing as objective truth, you know,
Exactly. I don't
it
think
gets
that
rather
what
difficult.
objective truth are you talking about? Like, who's going to be the authority that judges objective truth? Whose authority on what authority? And this just becomes claims of authority and debates over authority. And like, is it this scientist in this institution who's the authority, or is it that guy over there who's the authority? Who's to say? You know, like and this is my issue with like these appeals to science, because these are appeals to scientists. These are appeals to people conducting science. Now, science is not a book of beliefs. Science is a book of methods. And so science is done by people that bring their beliefs into their work. And so people start with a set of beliefs and they go do science around them. Science is not itself a book of beliefs.
Yeah, which is true. Okay, science is done by scientists. However, it's a self-correcting epistemological method. In other words,
In theory.
Well, yeah. So you know, as it should be, it's like those biases that scientists bring to the table and may, you know, bake into their research should be found out through repeated testing and other scientists, you know, looking at
But it's
their
also deeply
findings.
rooted in culture. It's deeply rooted in culture, and scientists can have a cultural perspective for an awfully long time. You know, racism was
Sure.
science for
Yeah,
centuries.
absolutely.
Um,
I mean, I helped edit a book called Psychology Gone Astray, which was looking at how psychology was deeply racist back in the early 1900s.
you know, and go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, and so I agree. It is, yes, but it as a belief, as an epistemological system, the scientific method and the body of science is a progress forward. It's a march forward, and it's never really a march backwards. You know,
Like, I don't want to sound like I'm anti-science. I'm not anti-science. Okay, I'm pro-science, but what I caution against though is blind appeals to science without recognizing the cultural values of the people that you're appealing to, and recognize that there are prejudices behind people who do science. You know, my big issue is environment and energy. This is where I came from before I was doing, and I've long been critical of environmental strategies. I'm a deep green environmentalist. I care deeply about, you know, environmental destruction. This is my core issue. But I've been deeply critical of the program promoted by the environmentalists of 100% renewable energy, because I don't think it works. And I argue that the problem is that it's a question of how they frame the analysis, that they frame the analysis in a flawed way, and that the science they're doing flows from a set of faulty assumptions that they're beginning the analysis with, starting with the idea that it's axiomatic that we have to eliminate all hydrocarbons from our economy in order to have a sound environment. I don't think that's true. Yeah, we can have a separate technical argument. That's a different discussion. I'm not going to go there. But I write about this stuff. And so I think that, you know, this entire program being run by the environmentalists, as well-intentioned as they are, is totally doomed to failure. And that there are other approaches that if you start from a different axiomatic assumption, for instance, if you recognize that the entire earth is a living breathing creature, then you recognize that the greenhouse gases are actually biological gases. They're not pollutants. They're perfectly fine. We have an imbalance in our system, but we can bring that system back in balance if we are putting all of our energy into restoring land use in restoring ecosystems rather than trying to shut down industries that we can't actually shut down because we depend on them. If we were putting all of that political energy and creativity and thought power into how do we restore our forests, we could actually create a carbon sink that would absorb all of our carbon emissions, and restore wildlife habitat and bring back the wildlife. But we don't do that because of a flawed set of axioms that we approach this problem with.
Well, I mean, when you talk about morality, I would say that any moral value system is goal orientated, which is to say that nothing makes any sense. So in conditional sentences, if then sentences, so that you have protasis and anapodosis, which is to say that if we want this, then we should do this, right? But what we forget to do very often is the if part. And we just concentrate on we should do this, we should do this, we should do this. For example, if I said to you, well, you should put oil in your car engine, right? That sounds pretty sensible. But if you were a scientist who was looking at the impact of not putting oil in your engine, then you shouldn't put oil in your engine. Because it depends what your goal is, right? So I'm kind of agreeing with what you say here broadly, which is what we never do enough of in doing any kind of politics or moral argumentation is setting out what we want the world to look like. Right?
Oh, yeah. What is the end game? Like, this is my question for liberals. What is you want all this social engineering and central planning? What are you central planning me towards? Like, what is the end game? This was Marx's big failure. Marx never offered an end game either. And this is why Marxism always goes running off the rails and turns into this totalitarian communist, because they talk all this big talk about revolution of the people, but then they never describe what the end game was supposed to look like. And it always goes awry.
So broadly speaking, whenever you do any politics, should be what is it that we want the world to look like, or our country or our society or our community, right? Once we've worked out the end game, then we can start filling in all the details and talk about how to get there, and have axiomatic systems as well that say, well, in getting there, we want to also have human rights.
So what is the atheist worldview? What is the atheist moral code? Like, what is
there isn't one, because atheism is merely a rejection of the belief in God, or actually, I don't think so. This is where there are two types of atheism. There's strong atheism and weak atheism, or positive atheism, negative atheism. Some people say atheism is a lack of belief in God. And I think they do that in order to get out of saying that atheism is a belief, because they think if it's a belief, it's then a belief system. And if it's a belief system, it's a religion, right? So I think that's what underwrites that. I am not that kind of atheist. I am a strong atheist, or a positive atheist. So I say it is a belief that God does not exist, right? So that is a proposition. That's what I believe, right? So atheism is a belief. It's a belief that God does not exist. If I didn't believe that, then I wouldn't be spending all my time arguing to toss on the internet with everyone that I can be bothered to argue with, right? And all the people commenting here who are atheists, I would say that's what they spend a lot of their time doing. And if you're spending a lot of your time arguing that God doesn't exist, then you believe that God doesn't exist. Therefore, I think most people really are, who say they're atheists, are probably positive atheists. Rather than having a lack of belief in God, they are positively believing that God doesn't exist. However, it stops there. That's it. That's what atheism is. Everything else is philosophy. So then what you have to do is you have to bolt things.
The question is, do you reject religion?
I reject anything that is morally problematic. So therefore, it's looking at what my moral value system is. But then it goes back to, my moral value system is going to be rather dependent on where I want what my view of what the world should be. So then it gets back to this question of, what do I want the world to look like? So for me, it's equality of opportunity. Is a really important tenet. Because there's John Rawls, a philosopher, John Rawls, said that he had this thing called the veil of ignorance. Right, the veil of ignorance is, imagine you don't know where and how and when you're going to be born into this world. Right, you don't know whether you're going to be a man, a woman, disabled, able-bodied, whatever. Right, sexuality, this or that culture, that skin color. If you don't know, what would your moral value system be? And actually it changes the way you think about morality. So if you're behind the veil of ignorance, it makes you go, oh, actually, we need a fairer society, because actually if I don't know where I'm going to be born and how I'm going to be born and what scenario I'm going to be born into, my moral value systems need to take that into account, and they need to be fair across the world and across society. So I would want to have, no matter who I was born to be, I would want to have the same access to opportunity that other people have. And so things like that. So that's how I start looking at the world. But I have to do an awful lot more. Like, atheism doesn't get me any of that. That's all philosophy. Like, humanism is your religious version of atheism, but that's a lot of philosophy that you have to add on to atheism in order to get there.
Yeah. And so the thing is the way I see it is that, religion is fundamentally political. It's always been about how people are organized. Societies organize themselves. Long before we had governments, people were organizing themselves around their religious beliefs. That as we transitioned from anything bigger than, clan and kin to the next, bigger organizations, this is where, spiritual beliefs came in, and how people, as a society, as any given community, make sense of this mysterious world we live in. And, they apply a bunch of mythology to, make tangible this, this intangible world. And, and from that, they draw, rituals, traditions, and their morality. And, because I believe firmly that morality is socially constructed. Now, listen to all these debates about, objective morality. And to me, it's pretty clear that our morals come from our communities. And why do I know that, murder is wrong? Because like everybody around me tells me that murder is wrong, and that if I go and murder somebody, all the people I love the most are going to condemn me. So I don't go murdering people because I don't want to be condemned by, the people that love me.
I would also add a huge dollop of empathy onto that. So I think empathy is one of the vital cogs of morality, which is, if I can imagine what it feels like to be you, and therefore murdering you, I wouldn't like that if someone,
Sure.
if I murdered you. So therefore, I think, empathy is a huge
100%,
component.
100%. Yep. And, and some of this morality is so common as it might as well be genetically imprinted, like don't murder people. I think that's pretty much a common moral structure all over the world. But other parts of our morality totally vary. Things about food choices, for instance. In America, we consider it deeply immoral to eat dogs or horses. But in other parts of the world, you can eat dogs and horses. Likewise, they think it's immoral to eat pigs and cows, and we eat pigs and cows.
Yeah, I think that is fascinating that we do. That is culturally derived, that for sure, because we absolutely go nuts over certain animals being eaten, and yet other animals we don't even.
And it's framed as a moral, and it's framed as a moral question. Same thing with sex. These are framed as moral questions, whether you can have non-monogamous sex lives or whatever. But you see it clearly changes from culture to culture. Cannibalism, most of the world thinks cannibalism is quite horrible, but there were cultures and have been cultures where, cannibalism is what they do. And within their moral worldview, it's perfectly appropriate, when some stranger comes to visit your village in the jungle, that you should eat them. And get whatever energy you get out of them. Or, I have no idea what they were thinking, the cannibals think, but we know they existed. And so the morality is clearly varies, and it's, in my opinion, clearly socially constructed. And so it can really change, and it changes as a function of many of our presuppositions.
So going back to what would you want the world to look like? What would you want the world to look like then?
Well, I want a world that is, vibrant in terms of life. Not one that's environmental destruction. As you said in your piece, like, I want a world where everybody has the opportunity to be fulfilled, to have dignity, a world of dignity for everybody at a minimum, a world that's healthy, ecologically sound, a world where wildlife is thriving. So these are all issues where, for instance, the secular humanists, and Sam Harris and people of his ilk will say we want to maximize human flourishing, that our number one moral issue is to maximize human flourishing, which sounds okay on first blush, but actually I don't agree with it, because what that does is it puts human needs ahead of the rest of the web of life. And it leads us to the kind of things we're doing now, where we would destroy the environment to serve ourselves.
But you could make an argument that human flourishing, it should be almost like you were saying before in the early sort of pagan belief systems whereby, or some indigenous belief systems whereby that you are part of nature and you understand your place in nature.
Now, if it goes hand in hand with
flourishing,
recognizing our implicit connection to the larger organism, and we implicitly recognize that human flourishing is tied to the flourishing of the larger organism, then yes, I would agree with him. But I never heard Sam Harris say that.
Maybe,
I never heard him espouse any kind of indigenous psychedelic worldview.
So I'm somewhat of an environmentalist, and I would be putting human flourishing up with a coextensive sort of an existence in harmony with nature and the rest of the ecosystem.
I want human flourishing, don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting we shouldn't seek human flourishing, but I think it comes in the context of a broader ecologically based morality, and that extends to animals too.
The question is then why would you want
because I think we're suffering. I think as the environment suffers, we suffer.
But that's the point. That's what I'm saying. Like, if you understand your flourishing in terms of the wider flourishing, then that makes sense. But would you want vibrancy or biodiversity or whatever you're espousing? Does that have value intrinsic value in and of itself?
I think there's definitely intrinsic spiritual value to a flourishing web of life that extends beyond something we can measure.
What do you mean by intrinsic spiritual value?
See, this is where you and I are going to part ways in terms of because I've listened to your talks on free will, and I take it that you correlate your lack of a belief in free will a lack of belief in God, that your atheism and your lack of belief in free will go hand in hand. Is that correct or not correct?
Not correct. Well, I think omni-God that judges and punishes. Well, no, I don't, but I also do. So omni-God is incoherence with regard to so many things, right? So many things, like why you would create anything in order to just give it pain. So why would you knowingly create X, Y, all these entities?
Well, it's a paradox. God creates us to suffer and die, but he also gave us the chance to enjoy life between now and then.
But if he knows which ones are going to suffer and die and then creates them anyway, then he's a complete bastard. So basically, omni-God makes no sense at all. But omni-God makes even less sense with a judgmental omni-God makes no sense.
It's a judgmental. I don't know. I actually have no problem with the suffering. It's the judgment that I don't accept. The judgment in hell. He's going to judge us for our sex lives, but he makes us completely sexual. It's like what are we being set up to fail here?
So this is all in terms of classical theism, which is omnibenevolent, omniscient, and omnipotent, right? So if that's your understanding of God, then none of it makes sense, and it makes no sense when you understand causal determinism. Now, I cannot understand free will in a libertarian sense. There is no philosophical way it makes any sense at all. I agree that we have free will if you are defining free will as doing what you want, but taking that understanding of causal determinism no further, which is kind of what's called compatibilism, which is the idea that causal determinism and free will are compatible, but actually we're always going to do what we're going to do in a given situation. It's just that what we do is what we want to do. So, for example, if I say after this interview, I'm going to go and make a cup of tea because I want to make a cup of tea, and I make that cup of tea, many philosophers will say, I had the free will to make that cup of tea, right? So that is compatibilism. However, I would say, but my wanting to make that cup of tea was itself causally determined, right? And so I would map that causality back and back and back and back, and you get to the Big Bang, unless you have random, indeterminate, quantum indeterminacy or whatever. But then that's not going to get you free will either. That's going to just introduce random into the causal framework. So the point being is that I don't believe in free will, libertarian free will. Right. So I don't believe that in any given situation you could do other than what you were going to do. But so if you made a decision X at this point in time and you went forward for 20 minutes and then we rewound back to this point in time, you would choose X again, Ed, because you are that person in that situation you are in, and nothing would have changed. No variables would have changed. So nothing could underwrite you making a different decision. That's how I understand free will. And I think that's a separate argument to God. However, if you believe in a judgmental
do you believe
God,
in a soul? Do you believe in a soul?
No. So because the soul is so often just actually, when you ask what is a soul, and I've done this, I've written chapters on this, what is a soul, what is a soul, people then say, well, actually it looks like rationality. Well, then it's rationality. It's consciousness. Well, then it's consciousness. This and this and this is your personality. Well, then it's your personality. Actually, when it's famously vague, soul. Do you believe in a soul?
Well, the mystics will tell us that that there's the kingdom of heaven is within, that there's a spark of the divine within us all, and I agree with that. So for me, yes, we can't define the soul any more than we can define God. We can't measure the soul. We can't see it under a microscope. So there are many materialists out there who would say we don't have a soul because it's not something we can directly observe. I've heard this argument from people. For me, I actually agree with a lot what you say. I do believe that the vast majority of the things we do are determined by outside forces. That I look at our life as soul and circumstances. That our circumstances drive the vast majority of our behavior. Things we're instructed to do, things we're forced to do by social pressures. The weather forces us around. Even our own bodies betray us. Our own bodies make us go
hungry,
do
tired.
things I don't want to do. That said, knowing that 99.999% of the time I'm doing things that I'm compelled to do by outside forces. That said, there is still that part of me on the inside that hates it, that is totally aware that I'm being forced around and despises it, and has this intrinsic desire to do something else, to do something creative, to do something that is coming from the inside out. Doing art. Our art is the best example of this. Why would an artist spend years behind closed doors pouring their heart out for something no one's ever going to see, that they're never going to make any money on, and they do it just for themselves? And if they don't do it, they hate themselves. Like, why? It doesn't make any sense at all. It's utterly irrational. I did it with my own book. Like, I spent 2 years working on my book. I'll never make the money back from that. Like, I don't even know if anyone's even going to read it. But I had this total compulsion that if I didn't write it, I was never going to forgive myself. And I just had to do it, just to satisfy my own self. It was something intrinsic. So I had a college professor, and I had this class. I got a degree in labor relations, and we had this class on the social psychology of the workplace. And it was like a graduate level seminar. And all of the professors and all the literature was always about framing all these external motivations we can do to get workers to work better. Like, how do we structure the workday, or structure their factory lines, or structure their reward, the benefit systems, the pay, and all these different reward and punishment systems to try and motivate the workers to be more effective workers. And there was this whole field of literature, and I kept writing papers. I had to turn in a paper every week, and I turned a paper every week saying to the professor, saying, you guys are getting it wrong. This whole field is BS. People actually, there's other reasons why people work. People work because they have a desire. Now, granted, people work because they have to work, don't get me wrong, but there's also an aspect of work where people want to make something, and they want to be proud of their work at the end of the day. They want to come out with the satisfaction that they've contributed, and they've done something positive with their life. That the bricklayer at the end of the day wants to be able to look back at his work with pride. The car maker, wants to be able to go with his buddies to the bar and say, look, did you see that, that Mustang we rolled off the line today? It was such a beauty. People take pride in their work, and they want to be able to be creative. And when you deny that internal creativity, that's the soul. That's the spark of the divine. When you deny that from people, you lose that. And it has moral implications when you don't recognize this internal creativity.
I don't deny what you're saying to some degree. I just wouldn't call it the soul. But yeah, I mean, those things I think are wrapped up in happiness and to do with purpose.
So a parallel argument is with animals. So
I just want to say, can I just say, Doc Pierre Romanot, I collect pineal glands of the deceased to gain power. I love this because Rene Descartes believed that the pineal gland was the source of how the soul attached to the body, and he that's the joke there. But I just love this idea that he's going around collecting.
So Descartes, that's a perfect that you should mention Descartes, because that leads exactly to what I was just about to start talking about. The idea that animals have personalities. So I was watching this. Descartes was famous for saying that, the animals are just a flesh machine and that they don't really suffer, and that, when he would do live vivisections on animals.
Yeah.
This is going back to the 1600s. So for years he did this. For like over 20 years, he would do live vivisections on animals. He'd cut them open while they're alive in a lecture hall, and he would say, to the audience, that when you hear the animal screaming in agony, that's just, the machinations of a flesh machine. Is no different than, if your wagon wheel breaks off and you hear the gears grinding on your machine, like that's all you're hearing. It's not actual suffering. And this has become a dominant mode of thought in the West ever since. And it translates directly to how we treat animals in industrial agriculture, because we don't recognize philosophically that animals either have personalities or that they truly suffer. William Lane Craig, I was just listening to a lecture just the other day where he says animals don't have the same kind of suffering we do.
So I've got a friend called Phil Halper who's debated on that point on Unbelievable on Premier Christian Radio, and he's released some papers on this. Exactly. So what William Lane Craig does, sorry I interrupted you, but he uses the work of Murray, who talks about how certain animals don't have this like level of pain or this conceptual understanding of pain, and he splits into the Halper takes that apart. And so Craig is relying on faulty like philosophy and psychology and biology to make that point, and he's just wrong.
It's vile, and it's both vile and it's presuppositional. It starts with an axiomatic belief, and then you create a set of logics to justify your axiomatic belief. If you believe that animals are less than us and it's okay for them to suffer, then you can rationalize some logic to justify that belief system. But if you believe instinctively, so this is what I was going to say, is that these animal researchers, these top-notch scientists, these animal psychologists were having this lecture about, does the animal, when your dog is going to get punished because they know that they did something wrong and they're all cowering, is that because they actually know something or because they're just responding to, their master's cues? And all these dog psychologists are saying, well, we really don't know. And we think they're just, and they were coming down saying that it's just responding to the animal's cues, pure Cartesian animalistic. Whereas people that are not scientists, I call this things that are so dumb only a scientist can believe it, because people that aren't scientists who spend time with animals, whether both pets and farm animals or even in nature, can see that animals totally have personalities, and they totally have very dynamic and dramatic personalities, and they can totally feel suffering and joy and love, and they have a full range of, they don't have our same intellects, but they do have our full range of emotions. And to not believe that animals suffer is immoral, in my opinion, and it leads to these very ghastly sorts of choices we make as a society, such as industrial animal agriculture. I'm not vegan. I'm not saying you can't eat meat, but I am saying we shouldn't treat animals in such vile ways. It's grossly immoral, and it flows from this idea that they don't have souls, they don't have personalities, and I think animals have a spark of the divine within just as we do.
Well, we would disagree with that because I don't know what spark of the divine means, but and I think broadly speaking, I wouldn't pit scientists and non-scientists in that debate, and I think there are plenty of good scientists plenty of science to support the fact that animals do indeed feel pain and have varying degrees of sentience. What I think is an interesting area is the connection between our complexity of psychology and language, and is there a lot to be said for our development of language, which allows us to. So I think language and psychology are coextensive, which is to say that what happens is we imagine you couldn't speak, right? You couldn't speak all your life and no one else spoke, right? That you had no imagine. Just think what speech has done for you all your life in your understanding of how everything works. Like all this whole talk of religion, free will, everything we talked about, morality, blah blah blah. You would have no concept of those things.
Totally. Totally.
without language there to express them. So at the very most, they would be stunted, or you'd feel certain aspects of them, but you wouldn't, like, there's no cognitive understanding. So our development of language and our development of things like, we wouldn't understand loyalty if we didn't understand the concept below that, but we wouldn't understand the concept below that until we had the language to go up to that level, blah, blah, blah. So that's going back down. So you work it up. So our language gets to this level, which allows our understanding psychology and abstract ideas to get to that level. Language goes there, and we develop that.
But also, I mean, animals have very extensive forms of communication. They just don't use words.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not saying they don't. Yeah, but what I'm saying is the key to, I think, understanding human exceptionalism, as far as we are exceptional in our understanding.
We certainly are different in some regard, for sure.
But the keys are opposable thumbs and language. I've always said opposable thumbs, our ability to use tools, and our ability to communicate, which means that you can pass knowledge across time. Like, no other animal can do that, but we can pass knowledge across time, which is and geography and space in a way that no other animals can. So I think the ability to use tools, opposable thumbs and language, that's a key to humanity, or the key to human exceptionalism, as far as that's a thing.
No, yeah, I agree with all that. It's just my issue is that, like, so much of our cultural reality is fabricated. It's people talk about, do we live in a hologram or in some kind of like digital, illusion or something? There is a certain truth to that. I don't buy that we're like in a digital, thing, but there is a truth to that. Our cultural reality is to a certain extent, artificial, that we have belief systems as a society that shape how we see the world. Again, coming back to my sort of Western versus indigenous contrast, we can inhabit the same physical space, be standing right next to each other, and see the world in completely different ways. And this is going to be rooted in our cultural traditions. And so as we move through the looking glass now as a civilization and into this very uncharted territory that we're moving into, I think we need to be very, very clear about what our morals are, and what our stories are, and come together as communities. And this is what religion does: is it provides a way to, that people organize themselves around a common set of beliefs. And the modern day secularist is very much making an assumption, I think, that our secular governmental institutions are going to continue to survive and be healthy and represent a coherent organizing principle. And that, I don't actually think that's a tested assumption going forward, that we don't actually know what the future is of our big government institutions a century from now.
Well, I think there was a lot of faith in the checks and balances being in place since 2016. I think a lot of that didn't seem to materialize, and people apparently can get away. Money changes pockets, and there you go. It's the systems and checks and balances can be manipulated, unfortunately. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see whether robust organizational structures can stay in place and do the job they're supposed to do, because they're falling short at the moment, and it appears that people are trying to vote or pass through anti-democratic laws. You've got voting laws that are just shocking.
We could, or if we just have a coup and some Christian general takes over and just doesn't give power back, an American Julius Caesar just takes power. It's not that outrageous of an idea. I mean, you hear chatter of it on the right wing already. They tell you, when you talk about a new Julius Caesar, like, watch out, like that's they're talking about a coup. And then where do you organize yourself? If we lose our political parties, then how are people organizing themselves as a community? Because this is what the atheists are losing. And I'm not suggesting we go back to Christian church, but we're giving up these communities that are more moral communities where you actually know what your neighbors believe because you all believe in something common.
Well, I think so. What I mean, it's interesting to loop this back to Only Sky, this new sort of platform. It's about building stories and narratives. It's about delivering news and media, and even stuff that doesn't have. I wrote an article on multiple sclerosis the other day that had absolutely nothing to do with atheism or anything, but it's just like, here's news through secular lenses. And some of it will look just like any other news, you know. But it's about, there isn't any kind of cohesive organization around that is delivering content from a secular point of view, from a, you know, there are little pockets here and there, but nothing on a broad scale, and that's what we wanted to challenge. We wanted to redress the balance there, because you look at the lobbying capabilities of the religious right in America, and it's phenomenal, the amount of money they have compared to, say, the lobbying capabilities of the American Humanist Association or American Atheists. It's just a drop in the ocean. So that there is a need, I think, for atheists to coalesce around, or be better represented, I think, rather than coalesce. But also, you know, things like the Sunday Assembly that provides, you know, a replacement church community and environment for atheists. You know, music, bringing them together, the shared values and music, things like that are really valid and necessary, I think, for building up communities of like-minded people who, in this case, don't believe in God, but still believe in a moral life and you know, values that are you know, beneficial for the world. I don't know, I'm sort of rambling now, but the idea is,
I mean, I agree with all those goals. The thing is, you're not really giving anyone anything symbolic to like believe in. It's this lack of symbolism that I think, you know, hurts those efforts. You're not really.
Yeah, but I don't think. Yeah, so that's really interesting. So, do you have to coalesce around some thing, some idol,
some catalyst,
right? Some very
catalyst to bring the, you know, to make the reaction happen,
or can you, you know, coalesce around a set of ideals, some kind of broader humanistic ideals or progressive political ideals?
But you got to code, you know. But where are they? Like, show them to me.
Well, human rights and general decent moral values.
It's all pretty vague, if you ask me.
Well, it's not vague, but you have to. It's not. The problem is, it's not like God said this and then that's it. So it's not like, you know, whatever thing. The easy thing about, say, Christian morality is you say, here's a bunch of moral rules. God said it.
Yeah, it's all authoritarian.
Right? And so it's all authoritarian. And you say, okay, but do they have any moral reasoning behind them? And the problem is, the Christian, if they believe in something called divine command theory, they which a lot of them do, is generally, well, no, it's good because God is within God and God's nature and it came from God. It's like, okay, well, does that mean it doesn't have moral reasoning? Because is it only good because it came from God? And we get into what's called the Euthyphro dilemma. So you know, I think there's a problem there with a lack of, like, it looks good on the veneer. It's like, here's what I believe, here's my God picture, and here's all the moral rules that represents my God belief. It's like, okay, but now when we unpick them using moral philosophy, they're really problematic, and some of them appear to be 2,000 years old and, quite frankly, bollocks. But for us, for an atheist like myself, we have to do that. We have to build up our moral proclamations from the bottom up, and do you know what, that takes an absolute shed load of moral philosophy, and that's difficult, and that requires a lot of thought. And
well, it also requires people coming together to hash it out. Most of our morality is not that complicated. It's only on the margins where we get into the nuances of things, where things get complicated. But the vast, you know, like the old cliche, you know, everything I learned in everything I need to know in life, I learned in kindergarten. Like 90% of our morality is like understandable to children, you know, like it's not that complicated. It's only along the edges where we get, you know, where you get into these nuanced, complicated positions where, you know, damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of scenarios.
So maybe the job of atheism then would be to coalesce around some kind of idea of that moral life.
But why throw out thousands of years of wisdom traditions just because you don't believe in God?
Well, what do you mean by wisdom?
What I've seen is that the atheists, those traditions date back to the 19th century. It's 19th century rationalists and people like, like Marx and Nietzsche and folks like this from the 19th century. But that, I read a lot of like comparative religion and mystics. And what I see is that mystical tradition, the wise men and sages who are free from authority and dogma, but are on a personal quest for, spiritual truth, that their journeys always dovetail, and that their messages and their teachings always dovetail towards some common ground of ultimate truth that's beyond our comprehension, but that they don't contradict with one another. One thing I feel is truth doesn't contradict truth, no matter where it comes from, if it's old or if it's new, whether it's instinctive or empirical. I don't think I don't ever seen an example where truth contradicts truth.
Well, not
so
if
when
you
I read
not
a
if you
1,000-year-old
deny
text of a mystic that makes sense to me, I hold on to that. I don't abandon it. I keep it.
Not if you're denying something is a truth, if it then contradicts. Of course, it's not. What you're doing is saying something that coheres is what you're really saying, because you say as soon as something does contradict, you call it not a truth. But the idea is that this is all just humans progressing, right? And some of them will be religious, some of them will be deistic or pagan or monotheistic or spiritualist or animist or whatever, and some of them will be atheists, right? But all humans are sort of going through life and hopefully progressing towards if you look now, I'd much rather live now than like 2,000 years ago, as far as human rights and longevity and health and all the provisions we have. Far rather live now. And so we are moving forward, but we're moving forward as a result of our humanity and our desire for finding the truth and for doing science and for understanding the world around us. I wouldn't tie it to any kind of like absolute sort of almost like a German idealistic idea of an absolute goodness or an absolute spirit or an absolute truth. It's just humans striving to better themselves. And in so doing, understand the world better in order to better themselves, and if we can hold on to doing that through a moral framework, a humanistic moral framework, then, more's.
I agree with all that. I just don't think we can answer it all rationally. I think there's a limit to rationalism. And at a certain point, you have to address the aspect of the human experience that's irrational, that's beyond human comprehension, the invisible world that lies beyond our senses.
What's that?
All the things that are going on that we can't see, that science demonstrates to us that is there.
Is it there?
Well, there's lots of things that science demonstrates to us that we can't see, like invisible gases, electromagnetic radiation, subatomic particles, microorganisms. There's lots of things that in the last 100 years we have discovered that are very, very important and very, very real in terms of like our physical bodies, but that prior to modern, instrumentation, we never identified them before.
Yeah, but we didn't make them up before we saw them.
But we had an intuitive sense that there was stuff going on. People talk about ghosts and spirits because they intuited that there was things that are happening. They just didn't know how to describe them.
No, they had evidence that they were happening and then supposed a theory and then tried to prove the theory. That's how the scientific method works. You don't sort of intuit. So I believe that there is no such thing as intuition. There is just like non-conscious calculations that are going on. So when classic one is like chicken sexing or World War II bomber spotters or plane spotters, they used to intuitively know whether that was a German or a British plane just straight away. It was like intuition, but it turns out that that's just really good non-conscious calculation that you're not actually conscious of. So
I'm a big believer in intuition. There's a radar system in your gut and you can tune into it, and I'm a big believer in it.
I would say that's your non-conscious brain that's got a vast computing power that can take in lots of data that your conscious brain is not remotely aware of and is making calculations based on that and will give you what feels like an intuition, but it's actually an evidence-based claim or belief or what have you, or hunch. But and sometimes it's not true because the calculation has actually got some faulty data or has been made wrong. But basically, yeah, I don't think there's a thing like, there's a really good book by David Eagleman called Incognito. It talks a lot about this, but which I advise reading. It's a very good book. But yeah, so I would disagree with you in there. And I think where you're talking about invisible things, like, I'd only suppose that an invisible thing existed if I had good reason to think that it existed.
I have perfectly good reason to believe that there are invisible things happening that science has not yet identified, that are beyond my imagination because I've never even imagined them. I have every reason to believe that there is lots of stuff like that happening right now.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are lots of things happening that we're not aware of, but I wouldn't, I know I'm being facetious here, but I wouldn't, say, oh, there's an invisible unicorn, and then try and plug the gap to find that invisible.
No, I mean, I'm just, like I said, I'm content with the idea that there is a mysterious world around us. So we had an intuition.
And I would agree with that. The world, there is stuff we don't know. Consciousness, genesis of the universe, if it did come into existence, that kind of stuff.
But even that they're much more even closer to our reality, that like there's just too many. It's easy to, like miracles. People, do miracles happen or not? It really depends on how you define a miracle. Are we still there? Are we?
Yep.
Okay. The question is, how do we define a miracle? I would define a miracle in a very prosaic way. I would say it's any unexplained good fortune. I can't believe I survived that car accident. It's a miracle. I can't believe I walked off that battlefield when all of my platoon mates are all dead. It's a miracle. I can't believe I walked out of that burning fire, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These things happen all the time. And it's always easy to explain them away. But at the same time, there is just this preponderance of strange, unexplained occurrences.
Well, but they are explained. And so there's something called, I don't know if you're aware, Littlewood's law. So Littlewood's law is a mathematical law that says that exactly the type of miracles you're talking about, which aren't ones that break the natural law. So some people just wouldn't agree that what you are describing is a miracle. It's just something.
Well, I'm just saying we describe it as miracle.
Yeah. But some people will. So Littlewood, a mathematician, said that those vastly improbable things are vastly improbable. He said that it turns out that improbable things happen all the time because things happen all the time. So statistically, so I'm going to make up the numbers here, but if you think things happen to me all the time, photons of light are hitting me, air waves, particles, everything, all the stuff is happening to me all the time, right? So in the course of a month, literally billions of things are happening to me. There are billions of events that are impacting me, and so therefore, if you're doing a billion things in a month, right, and the likelihood of something incredibly unlikely is 1 in a billion, then once a month you're going to have an incredibly unlikely event happening. So, and he statistically said, so basically miracles happen because incredibly improbable things happen to you very, very often. So given the course of the event of all the events that happen in your life all the time. I've explained that really badly because my words are failing me at the moment.
No, I get it. I get what you're saying, and these are not like, it's not a new, I've heard that argument before. I mean, it really comes back to just sort of these presuppositions about, do you believe, isn't it amazing? Oh yeah. I mean, I'm sure you heard what I was saying before about the salt waters as being where the Mesopotamians saw that, was the source of all life, and the waters are there in Genesis 1. And, which tracks modern science and biology, which tells us that, life on Earth emerges from the oceans. And so when the ancients say, the mother is the oceans, and the Rig Veda has this explicitly, then modern biology goes and tracks what the ancients already believed intuitively. I think that's pretty good, frankly. I mean,
it's either going to be earth or water, so there's 50-50, and some of the other myths said it was a land, so but yeah.
But there's other things. There's other old myths that I think that people poo-poo away. People poo-poo Noah's flood. Say, oh, there's just a million floods. There's just a million floods. That's why it's just a coincidence they've all got flood stories. I actually don't think it's a flood story per se. I think it's a story of a mass extinction event. and that mass extinction event did in fact happen 12,800 years ago in the Younger Dryas, and the fossil record proves that quite explicitly, that all the large animal fauna were wiped out. We can debate the reasons why, but it happens to happen at the end of the Ice Age when they were having massive floods, and maybe we were struck by a meteor, who knows? But we know in the fossil record that all the large animals were wiped out, and I think that is the story. I think it's this incredibly dramatic experience that nearly wiped out humanity too, and so these very scarred and traumatized humans preserve these memories as a mythology. That over time the original story gets lost, but the mythology remains.
Yeah, and I in principle I don't disagree. Although I would talk about like the classic sort of localized floods. Floods are really, really common, blah blah blah. But the point is that some naturalistic phenomenon is culturally sort of fossilized, if you like, into our human experience and our cultural baggage. And it comes out as being a story about God, when actually it's more about
Well, what's interesting when you look at the flood stories is the progression of explanations for why the flood happened. In the oldest version, so you got, again, tracking with the Sumerian, Babylonian, and then biblical, you got 3 different versions of the story. The oldest version of the story don't even offer an explanation. The second version of the story,
humans
we were making too much noise.
Yeah.
And then in the third version of the story, it's we were so bad, we had to be punished. And you see this progression of moral explanations.
And that's really interesting, because actually when you talk about intertextuality, which is drawing on other sources, it's all about, and I said this many times, and sorry if I've repeated myself to the audience, but it's about noticing the differences, what the difference is telling you. So some religious people will say, oh, look, this can't be drawing on that because of, look at all these differences. No. The differences are what are telling you things. So the similarities are like, yeah, whatever. So we've got a flood story. Yeah. I would obviously say that they're drawing on each other, but where are the differences? So we got this progression, as you say, of theology, really, which is no theology, which is just a kind of etiological story, which is to explain some kind of phenomenon that we know it happened, a flood, for example. Second one says, oh, humans are too noisy, and the third one says, no, humans were sinful, and it's that sin, and that's what this story for the Hebrews is. It's telling you the development of the theology.
Totally, yeah, and it's it's a fascinating story, and this speaks to what we were saying before about how modern archaeology and scholarship has sort of, blown open the doors on our understanding of the Bible that makes the traditional authoritative explanations no longer hold water, because we've got all these, like, just so much context now to interpret the stories.
Yeah. Okay, so to draw this to an end,
we're coming on 2 hours here, but it's been great. It's been great, and I've really been enjoying it.
Yeah. No, thank you. I mean, we disagree on an awful lot, and if we were to sit down and properly, go to town, there are so many rabbit holes to go down. When you talk about moral philosophy, I mean, there's a 50-hour debate in itself, and we did it in 10 minutes. But so what if you were to sum your worldview up in 1 minute, what would it be?
I mean, I call myself a deep green. That's the philosophy I've had for a long time. A deep green libertarian, if you want to get political. So I believe in, I believe in a deist kind of God, but I also believe in the mother as a living web of life, as the mother of us all, and that we have a moral and biological obligation to the ecology of the planet, and that in doing so, we can find our independence and freedom and diversity. And then that we can draw from a set of we can draw from these traditions. This is what I like, old traditions. I like to learn from these old mystical traditions and see what is still useful that we can still use. Reject everything else. If it doesn't work, get rid of it, but find the stuff that works. And so I embrace comparative religion, and I'll read from the Hindus and Buddhists and Confucianists, and I'll take whatever works. So that's kind of my worldview.
I think in reality, Ed, you're just pillaging world religions and history. I think you're the ultimate.
It's called synchronization. We've been doing it for a long time.
Yeah, you're the ultimate invader. Yeah, but you're sort of doing it from without invading.
from a 21st century internet perspective, where I can actually read foreign languages because it's all been translated for me. That's what's so beautiful about it all.
Yeah, interesting. Well, look, you know, we agree on quite a bit, although we might use different words for certain things. So sometimes there's an interesting discussion about what a soul is, and what, you know, we might actually end up agreeing on things, but you would call that a soul and I call that something else or whatever. But there's areas where we disagree, but hopefully it's been interesting to listen to for the audience. And yours is very much a different worldview, because normally it's like atheists versus Christians, and there's this kind of like, and you're presenting something that's different, and hopefully, you know, challenging for some people. Some people will just roll their eyes and go, that's a load of rubbish, and other people and other people will be like, yeah, no, I can take on elements of that for sure. So hopefully there's something for everyone there. Thank you very much. Do you want to very quickly talk about your website here?
Oh yeah. So Lost Goddess IO is my project. It's you know, I'm trying to take some of these, if you want to scroll down a little bit. I call it Myth and Meaning for the Cyber Age is what it says, but we're trying to take some of these old stories of the Divine Mother. You know, I've got my book, History of the Goddess. There's a short story there about Gnostic Mystery Jesus, where we sort of challenge the viewer to imagine what the West would be like if Christianity had taken a different form, with Gnostic and pagan beliefs still a part of it. Epic of Ishtar is coming. That's where I'm going to take, as it says, Inanna, Ishtar, and Astarte, and present them as one long narrative. Same as I did with the creation stories. Inanna, Ishtar, and Astarte is all one goddess. And then Juan Hernandez, an artist who's been doing a lot of work with me. So the site is full of his art. We're trying to do some stuff with that too. So I've got a Substack. If you want to get my Substack going again, I've been writing more regularly. So,
and a YouTube
channel there. I've got a YouTube channel. I'm getting that stuff back up and running now for the new year and trying to post regularly. So hopefully you'll be seeing more of me. I'd love to engage with you some more, John, and with the Only Sky crowd, and have more of these debates, because it's fun stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't want to be sort of too challenging to get bogged down in like arguing over every little thing. So I was trying to let you flow and say what you needed to say. So hopefully, you know, I've given you.
I appreciate that, and I've got a different position than other folks. So I'm eager to like air it out and have these discussions, because I've kind of arrived at my own conclusions on a few things. So.
Yeah, and sometimes airing things, well, not sometimes, and it's a really important thing to do, which is to talk about your things go around in your mind. And when you're on your own, in your own house or in your own study or in your own book or in your own mind, it's like things just like mill around. But when you talk about them,
I hear you.
You get a clarity. There's a real clarity that you then start going, oh, actually, no, not quite that, more of that. And I've been challenged on that.
Did I just say that? No, that doesn't make any sense at all.
Yeah. So I think there's a real value to these kind of things, which is as much about telling people what you believe as also understanding yourself what you believe, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I agree. And you know, last year I was kind of pitching myself as a scholar, but I'm not really a scholar of ancient history. I can't really claim to be an ancient scholar, and I'm not trying to position myself that way. The whole reason I wrote History of the Goddess was because I see these stories being relevant to today's politics and today's culture wars. And so that's what I'm really trying to get into, is that pointing out to the liberal left, frankly, that you guys don't know it, but everything you're fighting about in the culture wars ties back to these traditions of Asherah and these other goddesses. And it's like literally what they were doing in King Solomon's temple. Like all your transgenders and queers, and they were all there.
The last point, I don't know if you
so Asherah is represented by a totem pole. So she's a goddess, but she's also a totem pole. It's literally a carved wooden pole, and I believe it's the same traditions that the Native Americans brought to the Americas. That this is a really, really ancient tradition. We find it all over Russia and Siberia. Totem poles are really, really old, and so the Asherah is a totem pole that they put in King Solomon's temple, or they had them all over, really. And then the followers of Yahweh would chop them down. This is like one of the things that they were doing in overthrowing the goddess, was chop down these totem poles.
Yeah, interesting. There you go. Thank you for that. Well, look, everyone check out his work and book, and thank you so much for your time. we'll talk again, no doubt. But in the meantime, thank you for all the people who have supported. Thank you for the super chats. That's really, really important. It keeps me going. So I really appreciate that. And thanks for the people who have been sort of donating on PayPal and buy me a coffee. Really, really, really thank you so much. I can't thank you enough. So, well, I can. I'll have to stop now. But cheers, Ed. You take care.
Thanks, John. You too.
And we'll speak soon.